Hello, Lisa.
Hello.
Long time no see. Could you,
Someday I'll see you in person, maybe. I don't know if that
yes,
will
we'll
happen.
keep the hope alive.
Or
Uh,
maybe I'll move to Australia, the way things are going.
yeah,
Maybe
okay,
that's,
yeah. Well, it's closer than Canada anyway.
yeah. I don't know if Canada will let us in now.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just making a stupid geographical inaccurate statement that Australia is closer than than Canada. What was in my mind was the fact that Australia might be a bit safer. It's an island, as they call it. Anyway, greetings, and it's really a privilege to have you once again talking to me and the viewers via this channel, AIOCS Conversations. Before we roll the ball, just to remind the viewers that this isn't Lisa's first appearance here. Okay, so here's one that was some that's
Fearful, shocking kind of awe.
yeah, that was the second
Um,
conversation we had some well, more than a year ago or so. And this is the first one
uh, of
there's a lot
the
of from me always.
or just
Okay. Okay. And these have been very insightful conversations from my viewpoint. So numbers 23, 25 in the series, uh, where we sort of slided through a number of topics of common interest, especially um, uh, knowing Lisa's expertise in actually two worlds, two areas, environmental studies and religious studies. And it has been very enjoyable. And I noticed there was some enthusiasm on the part of the viewers, which is always good. And yes, the topic that we'll like to address today goes in the same vein, um, making sense of life and trying to enrich our experience in the here and now by developing an appreciation for the environment, um, what Lisa calls wonder. And we thought it would be fitting to begin this conversation by allowing Lisa to evoke moments from her biography, um, career, especially in the wake of the passing of Holmes Rolston.
Mhm.
Professor Lisa Sideris, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to see you
Okay.
again.
The ball is in your court.
So, yeah, I'd be happy to say some things about Holmes to begin with. So when I was a PhD student, I was reading a lot of kind of exposed to a lot of sort of eco-theology and ecofeminist thought, in particular, people like Sally McFaig and Rosemary Ruther, and then James Gustafson, who was a theologian who made a big impression on me. I don't know if you know Gustafson's work, but
I know by
he's very
name.
yeah, he's very critical of the Christian tradition for its kind of stubborn anthropocentrism. So I was reading Gustafson, uh, and then alongside Holmes Rolston. My graduate training was kind of cobbled together because there wasn't like an environmental ethicist or someone who did that work in my department. So I had to kind of, do a little bit of sort of religious studies, theology, ethics, and then I was studying like Darwinism and like um, kind of put together the environmental studies part on my own. So I started reading Rolston's work, and it struck me as very similar to James Gustafson's in its sort of critique of the human-centric way of viewing the world. So I ended up writing my dissertation on, which ended up being my first book, about the similarities between Gustafson's theocentric account and Rolston's sort of ecocentric account, and sort of seeing how these two things could go together. So after I got my PhD, that was my first book. And when I was putting out the book proposal, trying to get someone to take it, Columbia University Press was interested in it, and I got these reviewer comments that were really interesting and very generous, but sort of also corrected me on some little points that were just like things like I had referred to like a plant as a grass, and it was actually like a succulent. So it was like these little like scientific corrections about really, minutia like that, but then like this very broad understanding of theology and ethics and religion. I was like, who is this person? So it turned out that it was Ralston, and eventually he revealed his identity as one of the reviewers of my book, and we started, a long correspondence and conversation, and he would always sort of send me if there were like job ads, like you should apply for this job. And, the book did end up getting published, of course. And then a lot of it was about Ralston's work. So he was a great mentor to me and very generous, and probably had more of an influence on my thinking than any other person I studied. But the thing that's so interesting about Ralston's work, and this is something I share with my students, they read in my Intro to Environmental Ethics class, which is like 140 undergrads, is, his arguments about how humans, in dealing with natural systems, when animals are suffering from causes that are natural, that you should sort of not intervene and let nature take its course. And when it's suffering that humans have caused, then that's something that, we should be accountable for, and we should help to, to heal and treat those organisms. And because, evolution will adapt the species to the environment. And so if we intervene in that, and this is always a very, very interesting thing for students, because it's a difficult thing to accept because of our, sort of our compassion, our desire to help, and he has all these cases involving an animal that's suffering, and, sort of what's the right thing to do in this situation. And I really noticed that, because I just gave my students an exam not too long ago, that the person they remember the best is Ralston. They always get his philosophy and ethics down better than anybody else. So
for the ethically challenging ideas.
Yeah, because it really makes you think about, how to sort of bracket human biases when we're thinking about what's best for the natural world. And even though compassion is a good thing, there are times when, you have to think about something other than the individual organisms. The species and the ecosystem is having kind of this broader, systemic value. So that's an interesting leap for people to make, and it makes a big impression on them. So yes, I mean, he passed away recently, and I had some contact with him in the last year because I sent him an essay that I had written about monarchs. And when I was writing the essay, I dug out this old letter that he had sent to me in email, but it was written sort of as like as a sort of recounting this hike that we did together in Mexico to see the monarchs during a conference. And so he sort of was recounting what we did that day and what we saw, but also like reflecting on like the mystery of monarch migration. It was this beautiful little essay that he just kind of, spontaneously wrote and sent to me. And I have kept it since, when was that? 2009 or something, I think. 2008, because I think my son was 2 years old. And And so I went back and read his essay and sort of incorporated it into my own, and it was just sort of a nice thing. So I sent him my essay after it was published, and so we had a little correspondence, and that was the last time I heard from him.
Very moving. Well, it's interesting because you sort of cross paths outside of your, let's say, PhD research and your supervisory team and stuff like that, and then it turned out to be one of the most consequential encounters in your life. That's amazing. By the way, I think we share something in common. I think most of me is the outcome of other encounters rather than my supervisory team back in Bucharest.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, it's also really nice when, when a scholar, like a senior scholar like that, reaches out to, a young scholar and just, you don't think of these people as being like a real person, they're like books that you read and they seem like gods or something, and it's like when someone actually makes that connection and then, is sort of like, a booster of your career and stuff, that's a really great thing, especially when they weren't one of your main mentors. So yeah.
you said something. Of course, people know me with my tangents and zigzags and all that. While our conversation has a certain direction in theory, now I have to take a step back from it. You said something very interesting at some point. It's that ethical dilemma. So on the one hand, you have this noble part of humanity that still has compassion and has compassion not only towards other human beings, but also towards our sisters and brothers out there in the natural world. And perhaps we shed tears when, we had some moments in, I think it was our second conversation about pets and that, but also when we are exposed to the real deal, things that we see in nature, or via documentaries and stuff like that. When we see, I mean, really, I'm not trying to elicit more tears from both of us, but I've seen some months ago a horrible moment with a lion in the savannah, beaten by a cobra or something. It was horrible, really. I couldn't watch till the end.
Yeah.
But so on the one hand, you have this let's call it again noble side of humanity, full of compassion, which, by the way, is my definition of humanity. There's no compassion, there's no humanity, from my viewpoint. Maybe I'm too Romanian here. We have a word. Yeah, we have a word that comes from human being, Latin stuff, and the words that describes a compassionate attitude to things, to people, beings, and so on, is omenia. So omenia is an attitude of humanity, but something very embodied. It's not something idealistic, very embodied. You are there, you are in the presence of something, let's say, the suffering of a living thing. And you can't abstain from being moved. You cannot postpone emotion. And so I hear your students. And on the other hand, you have Rolston saying through you that, well, in reality, we should accept these things for what they are in nature. However, we should do something about what we cause. So that I think that's a very important distinction. But where I'm trying to get, the famous case, because you mentioned Darwin earlier. The famous case, I don't know, is it apocryphal or not? I haven't read Darwin's diary or something. With his famous crisis, when he saw the behavior of a wasp stinging some, I don't remember, caterpillar or whatever, paralyzing the caterpillar so that it cannot defend itself. whatever can be done in that situation. But inserting or laying its eggs, the wasp laying its eggs in the body of the caterpillar, and the eggs hatch and eat the caterpillar alive from within, which apparently caused Darwin such a crisis that
Yeah.
it's one of those moments when he said it can't be a world made by a good divinity.
Yeah.
I think this story with Darwin can be very differently understood, processed in the light of the distinction you made.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I actually wrote an essay. There was a book that the whole thing was in honor of Holmes Rolston several years ago. Christopher Preston edited it, and I think it was I don't know if there were two editors. I know he was one of the editors. Anyway, the essay that I wrote was about kind of using Ralston's work as a way of answering some of Darwin's misgivings about about the impossibility of believing that there could be, a good God in the world that he saw, where there was so much suffering. So, I mean, I think in some ways Darwin felt like because his theory had exposed so much suffering in nature that he was almost like responsible for it. It was like that was really the dark side of his success as a scientist, was that now the world looks very different through this lens. And for him, he didn't seem able to ever reconcile the amount of suffering in the world with the idea that there could be a good God. Although, I mean, a lot of people say that in Darwin's biography, the more significant thing really was when one of his children died, and that was kind of a turning point for him, just that he could not accept, you know, that a decent, moral, compassionate God would allow children to suffer and die. So that was really a significant moment for him as well, and maybe more significant than some of these of witnessing suffering in the natural world. But I have always sort of thought that Ralston did a really good job of sort of confronting that suffering for what it is, and even seeing that it has purposes. It's not completely dysfunctional or wasteful. That there are sort of what Ralston calls like disvalues, suffering and pain and predation and hunger produce values, and that evolution is a value producing process. And so the individual, for the individual, not so much, right? The individual suffers and dies, but for the good of the species or the ecosystem, or the evolution through suffering produces these higher qualities of beauty and speed in animals, that the predator can outrun its prey, and it sort of produces this complexity and beauty and all these amazing things that could not exist without suffering, and that's not incompatible, for Ralston at least, with seeing some sort of purposeful structure in nature that maybe is not exactly theistic evolution, but something sort of like that, that there's something divine that works through nature. And Darwin just could not accept that.
Because perhaps his theology was weaker than Ralston's. That can be something. I mean, I had a chat with a friend some weeks ago. Nicola, you know her, Nicola from Auckland. And it was on slightly similar idea, but we're talking about the bad outcomes of bad theology, or a theology that is not very nuanced and let's call it anchored realistically in a sense of nature, where what the theologians depict is a very static image of a dead idol, to put it bluntly.
Mhm.
Completely predictable, only good in whatever ways that entity acts. And of course, that good would correspond to our notions of what's good.
Mhm.
And I believe that this is a similar case. You know, if Darwin was fed up with ideas of a God that was completely predictable, you know, like your granny or whatever, stuff like that, and you expect only good things to come from granny. Um, of course, this kind of consciousness earthquake is unavoidable. But this is why it's so interesting to have someone like yourself, like Rolston and others, you know, to have a grounding in the natural sciences, but also a sense of this more ethereal, if you like, world of religion, spirituality, theology, uh, but connecting those dots, connecting those worlds. It
Yeah.
brings to a more realistic appraisal of the world, and theistic evolutionism or evolution, theistic evolution, or whatever it's called, you know, matters less from this viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Darwin was sort of starting from the standpoint of, when he was on, his Beagle voyage, he was reading, Paley, he was reading the arguments from design. And so, and it seemed he talks about all of this in his autobiography and other places that, it seemed really compelling to him. And so, I think if you start from the sort of standpoint of everything is designed, in this perfect way, um, and to maximize good for everything all the time, then it would be a shock to start looking at the world through this lens of, all what might seem like a wasteful process. Um, so many, why does the oak tree produce so many acorns, like it's so effusive and excessive and so much goes to waste. And why are there so many animals that suffer and die? And Darwin wrote, like, in The Origin of Species, like he's like counting how many, like, birds or something died in this one winter or something, like, on my property alone this many birds died in this period of time. And but he also then has this little conversation with himself that's sort of like kind of answering his own question, that most of the time he argues, it's almost like he's trying to argue himself out of it, or maybe convince the reader not to be horrified by his theory, that most of the time there isn't really waste in nature, that when something is produced in abundance, something else uses that for food. Or that, pain isn't usually for no reason at all. It does produce something good in the end. That it's unusual, he says, for pain to sort of continue for a long period of time without some sort of benefit somewhere, if not to the organism itself, then to the species, So he's gesturing towards this kind of way of making sense of it, which you can still see evolution as having this kind of purposeful, functional quality that doesn't seem so horrifying and wasteful, but he never kind of quite gets there. And it seems that part of what he's trying to do is convince the reader, but it's also like he's trying to convince himself a little bit that,
Yeah, and it's of course it's a thorny issue, and I'd like to put theology aside, at least for a moment, uh, and look at these from a, let's call it, metaphysical, or rather ethical viewpoint. So is this a matter of reconciling part, the individual, and the whole? Because when we speak of suffering, we don't whatever that is. Sorry for this. We don't speak of suffering of a species, isn't it? Do we? We speak of the suffering of individuals within a species.
Right.
So
Yeah.
suffering is something that we predicate in relation to individual life forms.
Mhm.
And it's from my viewpoint, and from the viewpoint, let's call it of a compassionate heart, the idea of, looking away from the immediate suffering of the individual, of a part of the whole, is somehow a matter of anesthetizing our sensitivity. Okay, so there's a greater good. Uh, I can understand that, and I assume theologians would be very happy to go with this thing. Okay, so there's always the greater scheme of things, and my suffering and the suffering of people next to me, and the suffering of beings, non-human beings next to me, and so on and so forth. Uh, makes something or makes sense in the grand scheme of things. Um, and I assume that this is something to keep in mind, instead of trying to just say, okay, well, that's a way of alleviating pain. And I mean, the suffering of my conscious processes, for example, when I process witnessing suffering, but on the other hand, I think that there's something legitimate there. But on the other hand, there's this idea of honoring the suffering beings, and I think this is something that we shy away from. And especially when, as you said, Darwin himself counted, I don't know how many thousands of birds that died during a horrible winter or something. And I read some years ago an edited collection put together by colleagues from the University of Sydney, Jay Johnston, one of the editors, about animal suffering. And again, it started on this note. Just think of the billions and billions and billions and trillions, perhaps, of animal deaths from the beginning of life on Earth.
Yeah.
How do we grapple with this? And I believe that from the viewpoint of, say, wonder, your topic, or contemplation of nature, which is my thing, although they aren't, of course, disconnected. There's this stumbling block of immediate suffering. How do you grapple with this from the viewpoint of wonder? Is this still this world with so much suffering, individual suffering, immediate suffering, not some ideal, whatever, benefits in the grand scheme of things? Is there something that wonder can help me grapple with the immediate loss of someone, or the suffering that I witness in the world?
Yeah. Well, I think it's harder in the human world actually because so much suffering in the human world is caused by humans. I mean, by humans doing things that, are stupid or evil. When you look at suffering in the natural world, and of course it gets very complicated because so much of what we're doing to the environment makes it much harder to maintain that distinction between what's natural suffering and what's not. I mean, climate change is impacting everything. Is that when when you see, I don't know, organisms suffering from drought conditions or, other climatic shifts, it's like that's, ultimately probably anthropogenic climate change. So in any case, I think it's much harder now to sort of say, well, there's suffering in nature and there's suffering in culture. But it does seem to me that sort of, nature left to its own devices does tend to, as Ralston thought, to create something positive out of these experiences that organisms have of suffering, just like it can for humans. It doesn't always do that. I mean, higher primates also have their own kind of ethical systems that many of them work out. There's studies that show that they remember which ones, were were reciprocated their kindness and which ones didn't. And, you know, it drives all kinds of complex things. It makes them smarter, maybe makes them more compassionate as well. I mean,
And more
there's something going on in evolution as a result of these moments of suffering. But I think it's in some ways it's much harder, I think, in the human realm and human culture to feel that something good necessarily comes from all this suffering because humans have, I don't know, put their thumb on the scale or something. It's not, we've created so much more suffering than is necessary for people to come to the conclusion that, that life is valuable.
Yeah.
Because, talked about this before, the wonder and grief being a sort of flip side of each other, or at least that's sort of what I said in one of our conversations. I think that wonder and grief both can have this sort of effect of decentering you, of expanding your ability to sort of take things in and be shaped by them and changed by them. And so I think that in the same way, I think that suffering can kind of help to decenter the ego and make you more open and vulnerable to others around you and to different experiences. But suffering just piled on suffering, and so much of the suffering that humans create, I think it does become dysfunctional and people become inured to it. They begin to have fatigue, compassion fatigue. They don't have empathy. I mean, I think we're living in a time, at least in my country, where a lot of people don't have any empathy at all for others who are suffering or hungry or poor or, so
different culture.
something's gone awry. Something has gone awry when that happens, I think. It's not the way it should be.
I mean, yeah, actually, I have to share this with the viewers. When we started to think of this conversation, what I had in mind was to zigzag between your two latest articles with Monarch Jeremiah and the one I just showed. Let me go back to them because I think that these two articles capture a paradox. So let me go to the Monarch Jeremiah, where you return, of course, engage in Rolston. You engage the topic of our footprint, our environmental footprint, and what happens, at least in the case of the monarchs, which you love so much and always speak of very fondly. Yeah, of course, this is a complex article. It cannot be reduced to one aspect, but yeah, you noticed over the years the fluctuations of the what do you call it, migration patterns and so on and so forth, and what happens when their usual places, nesting places, whatever they are called. I'm foreign to this
Roosting, yeah.
terminology. Thank you. They are disturbed or destroyed by us. On the other hand, so that will be. Although your monarch Jeremiah is not only bad news because you mentioned the fact that there's a return. Yeah, you noticed, and thank God for that, and for nature's generative power. Uh, on the other hand, there's this again more, let's call it optimistic, um, long-term approach to uh, nature, to observing natural rhythms, where miracles do occur. Um, Miracles that are of an aesthetic and undoubtedly ethical and also existential value, like super blooms and super organisms, where out of the desert, you have this. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think these are, the landmarks between which we are supposed to move, in terms of developing a realistic appreciation for nature, but at the same time, one that inspires us. And I assume that if there's something like a bottom line to this paradox of perspectives, would be there's still hope, regardless of how bad we failed to minister to nature.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, in part because I think in both of these essays with monarchs and with super blooms, is that they have their own agency and creativity, they have worked out a way of being in the world that is, is adapted to and adaptable to a lot of changing circumstances, but, within limits. Um, and I mean, I think that what's the connection maybe between those two essays, or one connection, is that like the phenomenon of migration itself, of monarch migration, is sort of in some ways distinct from, or needs to be thought of as distinct from, just protecting the monarchs. Because I mean, now, they say that, and I'm talking about monarchs generally, but there's Eastern ones and Western ones. So there's the ones that go all the way down to Mexico and, up to Canada, and then the generations go back to Mexico. And then there's the ones that come out here to California and roost on the coast, which we see out here. So migration itself seems to be the thing that's threatened, according to some studies. Like, individual groups of monarchs will continue to exist here and there, and in their summer breeding grounds, they seem to be doing okay. But when they are migrating and when they go to these roosting sites, then their numbers are dropping. And so you need to sort of shift your focus from thinking about just protecting these individual creatures, or even like the species, to thinking about protecting something like migration itself, which is a strange phenomenon because it's one of these emergent kind of properties from individual butterflies together sort of create this phenomenon. And it looks like, maybe humans even provided, I mean, not surprisingly, provided the conditions for monarchs to figure out how to migrate through things like, giving them the right kinds of host plants that they need, which is milkweed for monarchs. That this encouraged them to sort of travel further and further until they developed this amazing ability to do this thing that no one really understands. Like, no one, right? Because the butterflies who go all the way to, well, there's several generations, right? They go from Mexico up to Canada. There's, monarchs laying eggs along the way, and new monarchs being born and hatched from those eggs, and then moving further up, further up. And then there's the sort of super migrators that go then all the way from like Canada down to Mexico and go to exactly the same place where their ancestors were. And no one really knows how they do that because they've never been there before, and it's like, well, maybe they're following, the moon or the stars, or maybe it's, some sort of magnetic fields. But even so, like, even to like, that's not really an explanation. I mean, it's like, but how are they doing that? Even if they're following the moon and the stars, like, how do they know how to do that? So the phenomenon itself that seems to be endangered is something that's it's a spatial and temporal thing. It's like it requires us to sort of think differently about what it is we're protecting. And when it also means protecting the roosting sites in particular, which interestingly in California and in some other places too, those are eucalyptus trees, which came from Australia. And so they're, non-native, and some people hate them because they are flammable, and they grow really fast, and they're like a big weed, some people say. So there's people really hate eucalyptus, and they want them all cut down, but that's what the monarch needs. So that's a very interesting thing too.
It
So
is.
we're like,
Wow.
we're implicated in all of these things, and it doesn't really mean that like it's not natural. Like it's not so simple as to say like, well, migration's not a natural thing because humans enabled it. What it shows is how smart the monarchs are, actually, that they can take these different kinds of shifting environmental conditions, and they can adapt and then do something that we don't even understand. So I think, yeah, that's what I'd like to think about, is sort of shifting the focus to how these creatures are making their worlds. And we think like we're doing it or something, but like they're doing something that we can't even figure out how it works.
So that is amazing. So it's not just the part and the fall, it's or the individual and the species. It's much more. It's the whole environment, including the, let's call it, built environment. Although the eucalyptus trees, well, it's part of the built environment insofar as people brought those there to California. But this means that we have to be mindful of some kind of an adaptive scheme, and instead of just going by the data of 50 years or so ago, okay, so this is a monarch, this is what they do, they go from here to there, and so on and so forth. We need to keep monitoring all these trajectories, and whatever monarchs might innovate along the way, like
Yeah, they're innovative. Exactly. Yeah.
it's unbelievable. Yeah,
So like people are planting
wonder.
eucalyptus here on the coast. There's a eucalyptus planting initiative going on right now at one of the monarch groves here in Santa Barbara. And some people are horrified by that there's like, environmentalists, so-called environmentalists out there planting this invasive, non-native tree. But, that's what the monarch wants. And that's how we can sort of help them continue to migrate, because the roosting sites are really the things that need to be supported more than anything, where they hang out in the winter.
I'd like us to sort of conclude this discussion by addressing something else. Okay, so we both uh, alluded earlier to the strange times we live in. And it's not just the fact that empathy is at the premium now. It's the political situation out there. There's a lot of worry in the world. People who are aware of what happens in the world, because there's a lot of people who actually aren't aware.
Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, if we are avid consumers of news, we can't keep up with whatever horrible things happen in the world. I mean, only some weeks ago, I think the West got to a serious idea of how serious the situation is in certain parts of Africa, like Congo, Sudan and stuff like that, you know. Not to mention Ethiopia and other places. So we keep hearing of all these things, but there are also more persistently and consistently brought up news items like Palestine, Ukraine, and stuff like Syria, and so on. And there's a lot of uncertainty and distress experienced by many people. Can wonder and this refreshing interest in, say, monarch migrations or any other things happening in the natural world, can this kind of interest, can this kind of topic be used as a counterweight for all the distressing news that we get from the political arena and so on?
Well, I mean, speaking for myself, that is that is how I manage. I mean, right now there's like I was writing an essay the other day and I decided to throw in something about this little encounter that I had with right outside of my living room window. There's a hummingbird has made a little tiny nest. I mean, this thing, it's like that big. Perfect little thing, just tiniest nest, and now has some babies in there. I can't tell if there's one or two, but there's definitely at least one in there. And I've just been worrying about this hummingbird all the time, and my husband and I are both like checking on her to make sure she's okay. And she's gone for a while. It's like, when is she coming back? And so she's she goes out and finds food, finds flowers, and so I hung a little nectar thing there for her so she wouldn't have to go very far. And we're both like checking in on her all the time, and it's just been like it's been just so helpful to pay attention to this one little kind of miraculous thing that's happening right outside my window there. And I feel like if something happened to her, like that everything would just like I wouldn't be able to handle anything else that's going on. Like, so I mean, I really hope that nothing does happen, but it's just little things like that, I think. For me at least, or just writing something about like these super blooms or something, which is something that I've been really, that I've gotten to see here in California that I just think is so amazing, and I wanted to know more about it. And so like give myself an assignment of something that's like a happy thing, even though there's always threats from climate change and all of that. It's just, yeah, find these things to kind of immerse yourself in, that to remind you that there's like a whole other world out there, that thankfully is oblivious to our drama and our destruction. And that hummingbird has a little purpose in her life. She's got a job and she's doing it, and she doesn't care about us.
And the monarchs don't give a damn on passports.
Yeah, and we love them, but they don't really, I mean, and we should help them. But I think it's really, for me, I've always found it really, there's a strange kind of comfort that comes from encountering life forms that for whom, the human world is just not central to them, except when we enter into it as a force of destruction. So,
well, like a virus.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, and especially for people who inhabit urban places, I think this contact with nature being so scarce, so thin, many lose hope entirely because they lose this broader perspective of the hummingbird that does her stuff, the monarchs that do their stuff, and so many other animals and plants, all this complex, intricate web of interactions, relationships between various parts of an ecosystem, and so on and so forth. And I think there's no wonder that we are somehow bereft of hope when we watch the news, and many of us do, as I did, for instance, for months and months and months in a row, watching the news, because I really wanted to see not the next catastrophe, but to have a glimmer of hope in all the tragedy. For so many months, we had the tragedy of the Palestinians in Gaza, now in the West Bank, and so on and so forth. I mean, and I know the other people look at the same story from a different angle. For instance, I have been accused of anti-Semitism, which is funny because I have some Jewish blood. But not just that, because I really consume Jewish culture. But because I said, look, it's horrible what people do to people. And there were moments when I sort of, got in some kind of impasse.
And yeah, it is horrible.
Yeah, and then I returned to my usual drill from the pandemic days. Okay, so there's a leaf there moving in the wind, and all the sound nuances yeah, of the wind in the leaves.
Yeah.
And of the eucalyptus just out there. And so on and so forth. And then I notice how refreshing this is, and how much the human psyche needs this counterweight that comes from having some kind of contact with the natural world. Like you, I don't live in a highly urbanized area. So there's a lot of green around, plus the ocean and so on. But I think we should all discover this capacity for wonder at the tiniest of things. And they help us navigate these waters. And
yeah. And I mean, I guess what I've been thinking about a lot in terms of just my writing, things that I'm trying to write is the kind of wisdom that these organisms embody, that we can learn something from them, and how to tell stories about our relationship to nature that see these other creatures as being, as being world makers themselves, that, they're and that even things like restoration of the natural world is really only possible because the organisms know what to do. Humans aren't really doing the work of restoration. They're making it possible, for those conditions to happen. But it's because of the intelligence that inheres in these organisms that it's even possible to restore the natural world, because if you build it, they will come. If you create the right conditions, nature knows what to do. And I don't mean that to sound like, oh, everything will be fine, but there's a kind of intelligence that we're engaging with that's actually doing much of the work, I think, in conserving the natural world or restoring it. So that's not captured very well in most of the stories that we tell, at least in the Western traditions. I don't think it's been captured very well. But it's captured in other traditions where humans are the newcomer, or the dumb ones, and the plants and the animals are the teachers, and they've been here longer, which is actually evolutionarily true, that they have been here longer, and they make the world that we live in possible. And if we want to figure out, how to heal the planet, We need to heed their wisdom about, the particular kinds of knowledge that they have, that much of which we don't even really understand, like with things like migration. So yeah, and I think there's some consolation in that, but there's also just kind of the sense of awe of realizing that there are all these intelligences out there in the world.
Yes.
And once you
Non-human
start thinking that
agency.
way,
Yeah, which is one of the topics we were meant to address maybe next time.
finally getting to it right at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, because of me. Sorry for this. I get carried away.
Well, I think this question that you raised about suffering in nature and Darwin and Ralston, all of that is really, really interesting to me still. It always has been. I mean, these are questions of theodicy, and they're a big part of how we make sense of the world and how we misunderstand it, I think. So
Thank you very much, Lisa. Very insightful as
thank you.
ever. Thanks a lot on behalf
Thank
of
you.
myself
Thank
and the viewers.